The fire spat embers into the cold night air, writhing like spirits denied their final rest. The wooden stake stood at the center of the settlement square, bound in iron and rope, and at its base, kindling was stacked high, dry as bone. The scent of pitch clung thick to the night, mingling with sweat, smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Clara Bennett stood bound to that stake, wrists rubbed raw against the rough fibers of the rope. Her dress, once a modest blue, was torn and stained with the dust of the Dakota plains. Her long auburn hair hung in tangled sheets across her face, obscuring the terror in her gray-green eyes. A whisper of wind traced over her skin, cool against the sweat gathering at the nape of her neck. It was the last mercy the world would grant her. The gathered townsfolk watched in silence, their eyes reflecting the restless flames. Men, women, even children clutched each other, their faces tight with something between anger and fear. No one spoke, save for the preacher. Reverend Josiah Grayson stepped forward, his long black coat swaying with the movement. He was a tall man, wiry with the leanness of a life lived on hardship and zealotry. His eyes, cold and gray, bore into Clara as he lifted a worn leather-bound Bible high in one hand. "She came to us a stranger." His voice rang out, rich and commanding, the kind that held sway over a weak and frightened people. A woman of the East, bringing her corruption, her knowledge of the unholy, and in her wake, death. A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding, others tightening their grips on their torches. Clara shook her head, her voice hoarse from pleading hours before. "I have done nothing." "Lies," the preacher snarled. "You came, and sickness followed. Coincidence? Or a curse upon us?" Someone in the crowd cried out. "She touched my boy's forehead before he took sick. I saw it. My husband died not 2 days after she visited," another woman shrieked. The accusations came like blows, and Clara recoiled from each one, her breath catching. The sickness was already here. I tried to help. The preacher took another step forward, eyes gleaming. A temptress, a deceiver. Just as the serpent whispered into Eve's ear, so too does she weave her devil's works. We all saw her reading those strange texts, speaking in tongues. They were medical books, Clara shouted, but her voice was drowned in the growing fury of the crowd. Someone threw a rock. It struck her shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down her arm. The preacher turned back to the people, arms outstretched like some dark prophet. "She has been judged by God, and his judgment is fire." The crowd roared in approval. A torch was raised, its flame licking the night sky. A man, Harlan Finch, the town blacksmith, stepped forward, his thick beard matted with soot, his face a hardened mask. He was the one who had built the stake. Now he would be the one to end her. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, and then the sharp thwip of an arrow. The torch snapped from Harlan's hand, falling harmlessly to the dirt. The fire sputtered out, drowned in dust. For a moment, silence fell over the crowd, broken only by the wind whistling through the settlement. Then came the horse. A shadow moved between the torches, swift as a ghost, and then the beast was among them, kicking up a storm of dirt and smoke. The rider sat tall and unmoving, his silhouette cut against the flickering firelight. A bow was slung across his back, and in his hand a second arrow was already nocked. He was Lakota. Chaska. The name meant star, though in this moment he looked more like a storm given flesh. His long, black hair trailed in the wind, bound by a single strip of leather. His skin, tanned from sun and wind, was streaked with dust, and his eyes, black as obsidian, held no fear. He was dressed in buckskin, a knife strapped to his side, and his bow drawn tight. The people shrank back, whispers of Sioux passing through them like wind through the grass. The preacher's lips curled. "This is no concern of yours, savage. The woman is guilty. She will burn." Chaska did not move. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the smoke like a blade. "She has done nothing. She is a witch." "No." The single word was cold, firm. "She is a healer." For a moment, the crowd hesitated. A healer? Some of them had seen her tending wounds, had heard her speak of remedies. Doubt, thin as the smoke still rising from the extinguished torch, wavered in the air. But the preacher's grip was iron. "This is our law," he hissed. "And you have no place here, red man. Take your heathen words and go before we hang you beside her." Chaska's fingers twitched against the bowstring. "You are not warriors. You have no honor." With that, he spurred his horse forward. The crowd scattered. The stallion reared, hooves slashing the air. In a single motion, Chaska sliced through the ropes binding Clara with his knife. She fell forward, caught at the last moment by strong hands. For the first time, she looked into his face. And then she was lifted onto the horse, her body weak, shaking against the warmth of his back. The settlers rushed forward, but Chaska pulled hard on the reins, spinning the stallion toward the open plains. "Stop them!" the preacher bellowed. A shot rang out. The bullet whizzed past Clara's ear, close enough that she felt the heat of it. Chaska didn't flinch. He drove his knees into the horse's sides, and they shot forward, out of the square, into the darkness beyond. More shots. A second bullet struck the saddle, sending a jolt through her body, but the horse galloped on. The torches faded behind them, swallowed by the prairie night. Clara clung to him, her breath ragged. She had escaped death, but at what cost? The wind screamed across the open prairie, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the fading smoke of the torches they had left behind. Clara clung to Chaska, her arms locked around his waist, her breath shallow against the buckskin of his tunic. Her body still trembled from the fire's heat, from the ropes that had bit into her wrists, from the hands that had nearly delivered her to death. Chaska rode hard, his grip steady on the reins, his posture unshaken by the bullets that had chased them. The great stallion beneath them thundered across the earth, each stride widening the distance between them and the settlement that had nearly been her grave. It wasn't until the night swallowed them whole that he finally slowed, allowing the horse to catch its breath. Clara did not speak, nor did she loosen her grip. Her heart pounded in time with the hooves beneath them. They rode in silence until the land began to change. Rolling hills replaced the endless flat, and shadows of trees rose in the distance, dark against the starlit sky. A stream cut through the land ahead, its waters glinting silver in the moonlight. Only then did Chaska pull the horse to a stop, sliding from the saddle with effortless grace. He reached up, gripping Clara's waist, and before she could protest, he lifted her down as though she weighed nothing. Her legs gave out the moment her feet touched the ground. Chaska caught her. For a moment, she stayed there, pressed against his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. His heartbeat, strong and unhurried, thudded beneath her cheek. She had not realized how cold she was until now. He let her go as soon as she found her footing. Stepping away, he unfastened a water skin from his saddle and handed it to her. "Drink." She hesitated, then took it. The water was cool, crisp, washing away the taste of dust and smoke that clung to her tongue. Chaska crouched near the stream, filling a second water skin. "You are lucky," he said without looking at her. Clara wiped her mouth, still breathless. "You call that lucky?" He glanced up, and though his face remained impassive, there was something in his eyes that was not unkind. "You are not dead." She exhaled sharply, sinking onto a nearby rock. "They wanted me to be." Her fingers curled around the water skin. "They believed I brought sickness to their town, that I was some kind of—" The word lodged in her throat, which Chaska finished for her. She looked at him, startled. "You knew." He nodded once. "I heard whispers of it 3 nights ago. A woman accused. A fire being built." His gaze darkened. "I have seen it before." Clara's throat tightened. She had heard of such things, of other women burned under the weight of fear and ignorance. But she had never imagined it would happen to her. "I only wanted to help them," she whispered. Chaska was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Men fear what they do not understand." She lifted her eyes to him. "And you? Do you fear me?" His expression did not change, but his voice softened just enough that she almost didn't notice. "No." Something in her chest loosened at that. Chaska stood, moving to his saddlebag. He pulled out a blanket and tossed it to her. Rest. We ride again at dawn. She caught it, the fabric rough but warm in her hands. Where are we going? West, he said simply. Away from those who hunt you. Her hands clenched the blanket. They'll come after us. His mouth curved slightly. Let them try. She didn't doubt that he meant it. The night passed in restless silence. Clara curled beneath the blanket, exhaustion warring with the memories of what had nearly happened. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames licking at the wood, felt the noose tightening around her wrists. But then she would hear the steady breathing of the man beside her, the quiet crackle of the small fire he had built, and slowly, so slowly, sleep took her. When she woke, the sun was just beginning to rise. The world was bathed in gold, and the scent of morning dew clung to the air. Chaska was already awake, crouched near the stream, sharpening his knife with practiced ease. She pushed herself up, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. You didn't sleep, she observed. He did not answer. She frowned. Why save me? This time, he did look at her. Would you rather I left you? No. The word came too quickly, too desperately. She hesitated, then said, I only meant you don't know me. You risked your life for a stranger. Chaska's fingers stilled on the blade. Not a stranger. A healer. She blinked. I have seen death, he said quietly. Too much of it. And I have seen men kill what they do not understand. My people, your people, it is no different. His dark eyes met hers. Not all things should be left to burn. Claire swallowed, looking away. They rode west. The land stretched before them, vast and unyielding. The prairie grasses swayed like an ocean, the horizon endless. Chaska led them toward the hills, keeping to the less traveled paths, his sharp gaze ever watchful. By midday, they reached a dense grove of trees, where the shade offered brief respite from the sun's relentless glare. Chaska dismounted, motioning for Clara to do the same. She swung her leg over the saddle, but as soon as her boots hit the ground, her knees buckled. She caught herself against the horse's side, cursing under her breath. Chaska was beside her in an instant. You are weak, he said. I'm fine. She waved him off, though her body betrayed her. You are nearly burned alive. You have not eaten. Your body disagrees. She scowled, but before she could argue further, her stomach made a sound that left no room for denial. Chaska smirked. She crossed her arms. If you laugh, I swear I'll. The snap of a branch cut her short. Chaska went still. The air shifted. Then came the voices. Distant at first, growing closer. Male. Harsh. Clara's heart lurched. Chaska's bow was already in his hands. An arrow knocked. He motioned for her to move. She didn't need to be told twice. She backed into the shadows of the trees, pressing herself low against the trunk of an oak. The voices sharpened. I tell you, he took her this way. How do you know? Tracks horse tracks. And I don't see any goddamn Sioux riding into town alone, do you? A third voice. Reverend wants the witch back. You don't care how. Clara's blood ran cold. Chaska moved without sound. He pressed a hand to her shoulder, signaling her to stay put. Then, like a wraith, he slipped through the trees. The men grew closer. 4 of them, rifles in hand. Clara's breath caught in her throat. One of them stopped, squinting at the undergrowth. Something ain't right. The whisper of an arrow. A strangled cry. One man dropped. The other spun, but Chaska was already moving. He leapt from the brush like a specter, blade flashing. The second man barely had time to raise his gun before the knife found his throat. The remaining 2 turned tail, fear overtaking their bravado. Chaska let them run. Clara emerged from the trees, breathless. You let them go? They will spread fear to the others, he said. Make them think twice before following. She swallowed, still staring at the 2 dead men at his feet. Chaska turned to her. They would have killed you. She nodded, unable to speak. The sun cast long shadows across the earth. The hunt was not over, and they both knew it. The bodies lay still beneath the trees, their blood dark against the trampled earth. The air smelled of iron and pine, of death and damp soil. Clara forced herself to look away, to keep moving, but the horror clung to her like a second skin. Chaska crouched beside one of the dead men, running his fingers lightly over the rifle that had fallen from stiffening hands. He examined it with a practiced eye before slinging it over his shoulder. His movements were calm, efficient, as if death was an old companion. Clara swallowed. "They'll send more." "Yes," he said simply. The weight of it pressed against her chest. This wouldn't end with just these men. The Reverend wouldn't stop until she was dead or dragged back to that wretched town. Chaska turned toward her, his dark eyes assessing. "Can you still ride?" She nodded, though her body ached from exhaustion, from fear. "I can." He said nothing more, just moved toward his horse, mounting with a practiced ease. Clara followed, though she barely had the strength to pull herself into the saddle. She bit down against the pain, the hunger, the fear clawing at the edges of her mind. Chaska led them deeper into the wilderness, following the curves of the land, the hidden trails that only those who belonged to this place could see. Clara didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. The only way was forward, away from the reach of those who wanted her dead. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent, turning the sky into a bleeding canvas of red and gold. They did not stop. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers of things unseen, the distant cries of wolves. Then Clara heard it. Hoofbeats, distant but gaining. Her breath hitched. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dust rose in the distance. 6 riders. Chaska saw them, too. He muttered something in his own tongue, then yanked the reins hard. "Ride!" The stallion lurched forward, and Clara barely kept her grip. Her own horse followed instinctively, muscles coiling, hooves pounding against the earth. The wind tore at her hair, her breath burning in her chest. The riders gave chase. Gunfire cracked through the trees. A bullet hissed past Clara's ear, splintering bark as it struck a tree beside her. She gasped, ducking low against her horse's neck. Chaska veered sharply to the left, leading them into a narrow pass between jagged rocks. Clara followed, her vision blurred by the speed, the fear. More shots rang out, then a cry of pain. One of the riders tumbled from his saddle, his body crumpling against the earth. Chaska had fired without slowing, his rifle still smoking in his hands. They cleared the pass, bursting into a wide-open stretch of land. Ahead, the river cut across their path, swollen with the rains, churning violently. Clara's stomach twisted. "We can't cross that." Chaska didn't answer. He pushed his horse faster, straight toward the raging water. Clara's breath caught. Then he leapt. The great stallion lunged forward, clearing the first rush of water before plunging into the current. The beast fought against the pull, muscles straining. Clara had no time to hesitate. She urged her horse forward, her body screaming in protest, and then she was flying through the air, then crashing into the cold, merciless river. The current seized her instantly. Her horse fought beneath her, struggling against the pull, against the weight of its rider. Clara clung to the saddle, her fingers slipping, water filling her mouth, her lungs. Then strong hands grabbed her. Chaska! His grip was unyielding, dragging her toward him. His horse, more powerful, steadier, bore the weight of them both. "Hold on," he growled. She did. Somehow, they reached the other side. The horses clawed their way on his solid ground, breath heaving, bodies soaked and shaking. Clara collapsed against Chaska, her body trembling. The riders had stopped at the river's edge, hesitating, their horses shying from the current. Chaska exhaled sharply. "They won't cross." Clara lifted her head, her breath still ragged. "How do you know?" He met her gaze. "Because they fear death more than they want you." A chill ran through her. The river had saved them, but for how long? Chaska pulled his horse toward the trees, motioning for her to follow. "We cannot stop here." She nodded, her body screaming in protest, but she followed. The night swallowed them whole. They rode until the sky turned black, until the world became nothing but the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the sound of their own breath. Then, finally, Chaska slowed. A clearing stretched before them, untouched, surrounded by towering pines. A small cave yawned against the rock face, half hidden by brush. "We rest here," he said. Clara nearly collapsed from the saddle. Her body ached, her skin frozen. She stumbled forward, barely able to stand. Chaska caught her before she fell. She shivered, her breath uneven. Why are you helping me?" His grip tightened. For the first time, his expression softened just slightly. "Because you were not meant to burn." She stared at him, her chest tight. The fire crackled between them, its warmth licking at their skin, chasing away the ghosts of the river, the gunfire, the fear. Clara watched the flames dance, her fingers curled around the blanket he had given her. The weight of exhaustion pressed heavy against her bones. Chaska sat across from her, silent, watchful. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles, the quiet strength in his eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something close to safe. But it would not last, because the hunt was not over, and the Reverend would not stop. Not until she was ash.